I've noted in an earlier session that Israelites owned slaves. And here is my sort of go-to text on this from Leviticus. Israelites owned slaves and in fact were permitted to treat their foreign slaves as poorly as they themselves had been treated in Egypt. So in principle, thinking back to America, the idea of an Exodus-oriented people themselves owning slaves isn't really unbiblical. But even at this point in history, the Exodus story was clearly understood as being a story about the sort of universal value of freedom and against slavery. And so many people, especially preachers, held up the Bible to oppose slavery. This is a quote from Granville Sharp, who was one of the great British abolitionists, who, again, clearly recognizing the Exodus story and its relevance to slavery, talking about the plagues and saying there's so many examples of God's vengeance against slaveholders, which ought to be had in everlasting remembrance, to warn everyone against slaveholding. Not surprisingly, many people in the African-American community also turned to the Bible for these kinds of messages. And not surprisingly, they identified America as the new Egypt. This is from Caesar Sartor, who is a freed slave in the North. Be pleased to recollect the miserable end of Pharaoh in consequence of his refusal to set those at liberty, whom he had unjustly reduced to cruel servitude. This is all anti-slavery talk, absolutely couched in pure Exodus terms. For many in the African-American community, their experience, even as they were sort of calling for a new Exodus, their experience was one of a reversal of the traditional Exodus account. They had, in fact, been taken out of their homeland, their promised land, and they were transported into the new Egypt. So they were conscious of this story from an entirely other direction. Now, with the Bible as the conceptual basis for the movement, for the abolitionist movement, an important issue arose, which is for slaves to be oppressed and deserving of being freed, they have to be equated with Israel, right? Israel is who gets saved by God. So were the slaves, in fact, identifiable with Israel? This essentially boiled down to, do we convert slaves to Christianity or not? Christianity being understood, of course, as the new Israel. Slave owners were, in fact, often loath to convert their slaves because it would confuse the social order. Baptists and Methodists, however, strongly abolitionist communities, Baptists and Methodists in particular, pushed for conversion and emancipation and began ordaining Black preachers, which is the beginnings of the Black church in America. The Exodus story also constituted the framework for the unfortunate idea of colonizing Liberia with America's free Black population, an idea that had a remarkably strong movement in this period. This was a movement that used the Exodus story, but in a problematic way. They recognized America as a new Egypt, and we're sort of trying to, again, reverse that backward kind of Exodus thing, right? America is the new Egypt. We want to send the Black population to the promised land of Liberia. But as a movement, right, what it ends up doing is saying, yes, America is the new Egypt, but rather than change America, we're just going to reinforce basically the notion that the Black population didn't actually belong in America. And the Black population, for the most part, recognized that that was not what they wanted, and not how they wanted their story to be told. Okay, the Civil War. There's so much to say in so little time. The main feature of the Civil War with regard to the Exodus story is that both sides claimed it. Everybody understood this to be the battle at the Red Sea. This was the culminating moment of the story. Lincoln saw this. Right? Pharaoh's country was cursed with plagues, and his hosts were drowned in the Red Sea for striving to retain a captive people who had already served them more than 400 years. Lincoln, of course, was the new Moses for the abolitionists. Right? Here's one preacher saying, he liberated more enslaved people than ever Moses set free, and those not of his kindred or his race. Again, if there's endless mentions of Washington as Moses, there's even more for Lincoln. Though Lincoln himself has one of my favorites. He was writing a letter to the governor of Illinois, who was a very strong abolitionist, just before the Emancipation Proclamation. And what he said in